after all of this.
I'm going to sit here.
Hey, this guy's got a good story to tell about his grandfather. And he also was a writer of books, author, and I get information from him through the secretary. All he said here is, hey, I've got a story to tell you. I'd like to come around. We're about your area. So the secretary hands it to me, and makes some phone calls. I got Jeremy here. You know? And hey, we're pleased to have you.
Thank you.
And what kind of uniform did you always wear?
Spandex.
Spandex?
Yeah.
You want me to explain about spandex first before we get started?
Let's just let their imaginations run wild. No, okay, thank you. Now, to explain that, I actually spent about half my life training in the sport of lobster. So, I like to go fast, like very sleek objects, so forth. But my dad, who's here today, his wing is actually back in the fighter wing, the Thunder Chief. So he always gave me a hard time about picking something that didn't have an engine. And I just told him I had an engine, it was Earth. So we were good. But thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank the museum staff for hosting us today. 75 years ago, almost to the day today, my grandfather's 11th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which belonged to the 11th Airborne, was physically committed to combat in the Pacific. Now, they were known as the Angels. So the 511th spent 33 days fighting on Leyte, before landing on Luzon to participate in the liberation of Manila. After 204 days of combat on Luzon, that was street, jungle, and mountain fighting, the Angels moved to Okinawa to prepare for the assault on Japan, and every single one of them thanked God that they did not have to make that jump because of the atomic bombs. But they did go to Japan. They were actually the first full unit onto mainland Japan. There they helped form General Douglas MacArthur's honor guard, and they protected the departure docks that all the dignitaries used to go out to the USS Missouri for the surrender ceremony. So between 1943 and 1945, members of the 11th Airborne would be awarded 2 Medals of Honor, 10 Distinguished Service Crosses, 483 Silver Stars, 10 Legion of Merit, 63 Soldier Medals, 108 Air Medals, 1,515 Bronze Stars, and 2,510 Purple Hearts. Several elements received Presidential Unit Citations and the Philippine Presidential Unit Citation. Now, having said that, how many of you have heard of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment before? Okay, 2 out of the room. Okay, so it's a pretty historic unit that almost no one has heard of, and so that's why I'm grateful that we could be here today to tell some of their story, and that's actually why I did publish the book. 3rd Battalion's Lieutenant Colonel Leyte, who would eventually lead the regiment, he said, "Little did we realize our unit was going to make a record unmatched in history." I spent 8 years researching this historic unit, and with so very few of the Angels still alive, of course I feel a need to share their story with the world today and help us all to remember what they did in the service of our country. One of those last paratroopers told me just 2 weeks ago on the phone, "I am afraid we are being forgotten." Most of the Angels I interviewed mentioned with a little bit of resentment how much attention the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions have received in recent years, and how little the 11th Airborne has been recognized for their accomplishments. Although I will mainly focus on the 511th Parachute Infantry today, I hope to honor all the Angels by sharing some of their stories today, just a piece. If any of you know what it's like to try to take a whole division's history and narrow it down to a 45-minute lecture, it feels almost impossible. So if you want the full story, you just have to buy my book. So let's go back in time 80 years. The United States was just experimenting with using parachutes to deploy military troops on the battlefield. Colonel Billy Mitchell proposed the idea of vertical envelopment back in World War I, but the idea never really took off. And so it wasn't until July of 1940 that military leadership formed a task platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia. And then not long after that, of course, Pearl Harbor occurred, and the States was officially in the war. And the War Department ordered the creation of several more airborne units, of which the 511th Parachute Infantry was the 10th regiment formed. And they were formed, of course, at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, which, if you have seen Band of Brothers or are familiar with the story of Easy Company, the 506th was there just a few months before the 511th got there. The commander of this unit was Colonel Orin D. Haugen, or Hagen, depends on which paratrooper you talk to, because I've heard troopers say both. He was one of the first officers in the Army to receive his jump wings. So in December of 1942, Airborne Command he was only 35 years old when they sent him to take charge of the regiment to Camp Toccoa. When he first got there, Orin ran cross country at West Point, and he played polo for the Army, so he was an athlete. And when his first handful of officers arrived, he took them in their pink and green uniforms. He took them up Currahee, and he said, "You are going to run this every day." Right? So welcome to Camp Toccoa. It's no wonder his men initially called the colonel the Great Stone Face, because he never smiled. And then as the training got harder, they started calling him the Hard Rock. So Colonel Haugen had strict standards, and he pushed his regiment really hard. He insisted that his men possess a tough mental attitude and be physically fit, and they actually preferred former athletes. So when the volunteers came in to camp, one of the first things they had to do was strip down to their underwear and walk before an acceptance committee with Colonel Haugen and his battalion commanders, where they were personally interviewed. And if they didn't pass, they were just shipped back. So again, welcome to Camp Toccoa. So Hardrock also required his troopers to have an IQ of 110 or higher on the Army Intelligence Test. That was actually the same requirement for officer candidate school. So as one of the paratroopers said years later, the 511th was looking for men smart enough to lead, but dumb enough to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Now, Colonel Haugen's standards were so strict that the Army sent 12,000 volunteers to Camp Toccoa, and of those 12,000, Colonel Haugen only accepted 2,000. So the War Department sent him a letter saying, "You need to ease up your requirements." And when he got the letter, Hardrock just laughed and turned to his staff and said, "They're too late, we've already filled a regiment." So he just kind of thumbed his nose at Washington. But to get the remaining men ready for parachute school, during the spring of 1943, Colonel Haugen's regiment practiced parachute landing forms. They jumped out of the 34-foot mock jump tower, which they called the Widowmaker, because that washed out more volunteers and recruits than any other exercise they did. A lot of the troopers remembered freezing to death at night. Remember, they were there in spring, and Camp Toccoa it's up in the hills, a little bit higher elevation. So they froze to death at night, and then when they were out running, doing double time everywhere during the day, they would splash around in Georgia's red mud. And there's a funny story of when one of the new volunteers got there, he jumped out of the truck, and he saw the red mud splashing, and he actually thought it was somebody else's blood. So he really questioned his decision to join the parachutes. So one thing is, on the runs on Currahee, the famous 3 miles up, 3 miles down trail, the colonel often would take the lead. He was a former runner, and he set the pace. And a lot of guys, at first they struggled to keep up. I talked to, he was a corporal at the time, but Stanley Young, of headquarters, 1st Battalion, and he told me that when they got to Currahee and the colonel was out there, Stanley told himself, "Well, if that old SOB can run this hill, so can I." And that's how he got up the hill. And of course, there was a method to Hardrock's madness. He actually anticipated his regiment going over to Europe and participating at some point in the invasion of Europe. So he wanted to get everybody battle ready. He said, "When the bullets start flying, you men will know that you are physically tough and mentally prepared for the shocks and real hardships of war." And the regiment's non-commissioned officers said it a little bit more clearly. They told the men, "You'll be able to chew razor blades and spit nails." So on March 21st, 1943, the 511th left Toccoa to join the newly formed 11th Airborne. So the commander of which was Major General Joseph Swing, who was one of America's most experienced airborne commanders. He was formerly the artillery commander of the 82nd Infantry, which became the 82nd Airborne Division. Of note, General Swing played football at West Point along with his roommate that you might recognize the name, Dwight Eisenhower. They played together, and they were both part of the class of 1915, which was, the class that the stars fell upon because so many became generals years later. But the 511th trained at Camp Mackall for about 4 months, and then they were sent to Fort Benning's parachute school, battalion by battalion, and they were so physically fit that they actually skipped phase A of jump school. And then they irritated the jump school instructors who would try to punish these guys by saying, "Okay, give me the 10 push-ups." And the angels would just smile at the instructor and do 20, just to make him mad, which caught up to all of them in the end. But they went straight to phase B, so they practiced judo and perfected their parachute landing forms. They honed their marksmanship on the firing range. And Colonel Haugen stressed to all of his paratroopers that they needed to qualify as expert, or at least marksman. And he said that all the enlisted men who do so will be promoted by 1 rank. So a lot of the guys worked really hard that day to qualify. And then during phase C, they dropped from Fort Benning's famous 250-foot jump towers. They learned to pack their own parachutes in the rigger shed. And one of the trainees asked the instructors, he said, "Hey, is there any guarantee that this parachute thing will work?" Because a lot of these guys had never even been close to a plane before. So to see this parachute and think to jump out of the plane, this question had some validity, but the instructor just looked at him and said, "No, dummy, but if it doesn't work, there will be a truck on the ground to pick up your remains." Keep on hacking. So a few days later, during phase D, the Angels experienced their first of 5 qualifying jumps, and D Company's Private David Iles, he experienced a rather painful first jump. The weekend before, he decided to lay out by Fort Benning's pool all afternoon, and very, very, very sunburned, so I can only imagine how painful that was, and the riggers tightened everything, and what that opening shot must have felt like. So his buddy, Private Billy Pettit, said he was just as red as a beet. So for the rest of the war, he was known as Red. And the only guy that I've heard of who had a worse time on those jumps was named Jorge Varela. He actually landed on a split rail fence, so 1 foot on one side, 1 on the other. So yeah, he was famous too. So, and in today's world, it's very easy to overlook just what these first jumps meant for these young paratroopers. The average age of the regiment was 21, and again, a lot of them had never seen a plane up close, let alone been inside one and ridden in one. And a lot of them joked that they went up in a lot of planes over the years before they ever landed in one after the war, because they're just so used to jumping out of them. So when my grandfather, who was a first lieutenant, I'm going to show you this picture really fast. This is Red right here on the right, on New Guinea. So he, cooled off just a little bit. But my grandfather, right there in the center, he was a first lieutenant in D Company, platoon leader. When we asked him what he was thinking on those first jumps, he said when he was sitting in the plane on the bench, he said, "I thought I must be crazy to be doing this." And then he said, once you're out in the air, wasn't so bad. You just floated down like a feather and just landed. So the Angels were very proud of the fact that while they were at Fort Benning, no one in the regiment hesitated at the door. And so, of course, they all completed their 5 jumps. They were awarded their jump wings, which they, as you can see in these pictures, were very proud of. They wore them when they went back to Camp Mackall. They, of course, pulled their hats off to the side and shined those boots until they looked like glass, and pretty much walked around like they were hot stuff. The problem was General Swing's division had a lot of different elements. You had artillery, you had medical, you had service, and of course 2 glider infantry regiments. So when the paratroopers got back thinking they were the kings of the castle, it may or may not have hurt some feelings in some of the other units. So, as Billy Pettit said, D Company said, we had our wings, we had our boots, we were just hot stuff. So some of the higher up officers frowned on the paratroopers' confidence, and that will come into play in just a second. But Captain Stephen Kavanaugh said, we were felt to be mavericks and troublemakers and prone to feel superior, which of course we were. So there was no lack of confidence in the 511th PIR. So it's no wonder General Swing said, the 511th was full of the greatest men in the world to go to war with, and the last people in the world I'd take home to date my baby sister. So General Swing has hands full trying to get his new division up and running, and he actually did a really great job very quickly. He was recognized. So much so that he was asked, or I shouldn't say asked, he was sent to North Africa to be the airborne advisor for his old roommate, General Dwight Eisenhower, for the operations in Sicily, the invasion of Sicily. Some of his recommendations were overruled, and he was very clear on that, and some of the things he said may have reduced the losses that occurred during Operation Husky. So as if any of you know history, there was tremendous losses in the airborne units in Operation Husky from friendly fire and some problems in the ground and some problems in the air. So when General Swing got back, there was a great debate going on within America's military. Do we continue to create and train airborne divisions, or should we instead create smaller regimental combat teams? Given the losses we had in Sicily, there were a lot that were leaning towards the regimental combat teams. Well, General Swing completely disagreed. He came back, and Airborne Command agreed with him. So General Swing was put in charge of a group of airborne officers at Camp Mackall called the Swing Board. And they studied all the problems that happened in Sicily, and then they published a training circular kind of outlining updated airborne procedures for operations, identifying what the problems were, and here's solutions. And a lot of that doctrine became the groundwork, or laid the groundwork for the invasion, the D-Day operations in Normandy. But they still had to prove that these new concepts would work. And so we have what was called the Knollwood maneuvers in December of 1943, where a reinforced 11th Airborne, following a very similar pattern to the airborne routes that were flown by the transports in Normandy. So they basically took what would happen on D-Day and they practiced it here, the Knollwood maneuvers, to see if it would work. And it actually worked so well, the 11th Airborne Division was so successful that America's military leadership changed their mind and said, we will continue with airborne divisions. There was a letter sent to General Swing. It was by General Leslie McNair, who was the commander of the Army Ground Forces. And he said, the successful performance of your division has convinced me that we were wrong. And I shall now recommend that we continue our present schedule of activating, training, and committing airborne divisions, which, as you can imagine, General Swing loved making the War Department eat their words. So I think he framed that letter and put it on the wall. But the Angels felt, well, pretty good about themselves, knowing that they had saved the future of airborne divisions. So when you look forward at even the histories of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions in the war, a lot of that was able to come to pass because of what the Angels did at the Knollwood maneuvers and so forth. So because of General Swing's foresight, the Swing Board and his whole division, what they did, helped pave the way for those historic divisions. And it also helped formulate effective airborne procedures that were used throughout the rest of the war and in the years to come. So when any publication gives that credit, usually to General Matthew Ridgway, General Swing said, our officers and men resented to no end. So again, it's a little part of history that the 11th Airborne is very frequently overlooked about. So after the Knollwood maneuvers, the Airborne returned to Camp Mackall for Christmas in 1943. They celebrated in town, doing some shopping, and of course they hit the local bars, and one paratrooper in D Company partied a little too hard, and the taxi driver just dumped him at the front gate of Camp Mackall, but stole his wallet. So inside the gate, Sergeant George Thomas, he saw the whole thing. So he went out and he picked up this, intoxicated paratrooper, took him to his bunk. Then he went and he got first platoon, and I wished I'd asked my grandpa before he died if he gave permission for this. But first platoon went back into town in a bus. They found the taxi cab company, and they went through their lot and turned over every one of their cars. They just got back in the bus and went back to town. So you don't mess with the angels. So. And I'm sure the people of the surrounding towns, especially Hoffman, were glad when 2 weeks later the division boarded trains for Camp Polk. So this would be their final testing ground before they were sent overseas. So at this point, the Angels were getting restless. Of course, they trained for many, many months, and they felt they were ready to go. They just kept saying, let's go, let's go, let's go. So their commanders tried to keep them busy with field problems, long marches, sporting events, and so forth. But it only worked to a certain extent. Camp Polk was the home of armored units. And so the 511th paratroopers saw the armored units walking around with their facsimile jump boots that looked like jump boots. My grandpa said all hell broke loose. So there were fights all over the commons areas and the bars and so forth. The paratroopers, they used to carry knives in their pocket to cut their risers if they got cut in a tree. So they would take those out of camp, and then they would take the boots off the tankers and cut them down to size, and either give them back or take them back to camp, and then the barefoot tankers would have to go back to camp and get their boots in camp and stuff. Right? So it caused a lot of problems, and so of course the armored units had a pretty big hatred for the airborne. But that said, there was a saying amongst Camp Polk's armored units that said, if you ever get in a fight with a paratrooper, you better bring your lunch because those guys never quit. So the 511th left their mark on Camp Polk right there. 4 months later, the 11th Airborne boarded trains once more, and as the trains moved north, the paratroopers started placing bets which way they would go, Europe or the Pacific. And they said when the train made a big left turn, they knew which front they were heading for. And the band played California Here I Come, and they just knew it was the Pacific. They have one stop to make, though. This was at Camp Stoneman near Pittsburgh, California. And they spent several days there completing their wills, doing the insurance forms, next of kin, and so forth. The phone booths there on the post were just inundated with angels making those final calls home, because they knew these last voice-to-voice communications would have to last for the duration. But in the midst of all that, they did say they enjoyed the meals at Stoneman, and they said they were being fattened for the kill. But Colonel Haugen, again, he was a competitor. He ran cross-country. So one day he heard that a former Marine unit had set Camp Stoneman's 12-mile march record. And so Colonel Haugen looked at that record and he said, you know what? We're going to do this. He said, we're not only going to do this, we're going to set a record that will knock their eyes out. And they did. The 511th PIR covered 12 miles in 2 hours and 48 minutes. So they crushed the Marines' record by a full 45 minutes. 45 minutes. And no other unit ever came close to that for the rest of the war. So it's no wonder First Lieutenant Leo Crawford of Headquarters 2nd Battalion said, I don't think the United States Army ever had a more physically fit unit with better morale. Again, they were ready to go. So on May 2nd, 1944, Colonel Haugen's 511th boarded the SS Sea Pike, which you can see right there. One of the only pictures of this ship, there were not many, and it might be because the paratroopers burned all the other ones, and I'll tell you why in a second. So they were given a letter from President Roosevelt, which read, the hope, confidence, and gratitude and prayers of your families, your fellow citizens, and your president go with you. Now, kind of a genetic letter. They appreciated hearing from their commander-in-chief. But there was a second letter with the presidential seal that was delivered to Alex Village Center, who is on the right of this picture right here. Not a great picture. There's not many pictures of Alex. So this was the second letter, so of course it generated a lot of attention, and Alex was still on deck, so a lot in D Company, a lot of paratroopers gathered around Alex as he read it out loud, and they were shocked to hear that Alex's brothers had been killed in Europe. There was a letter saying that Alex could go home to his family at South Dakota's Standing Rock Indian Reservation if he wanted. This brought the war very close to their minds. And everybody waited in silence as Alex quietly folded that letter, and he paused, and he looked at his friends, and he said, "You are my brothers now." And he chose to stay and fight all the way to Tokyo. Private Chauncey Poole, which is, I think on the left over there, he said, "We called Alex Chief out of respect and admiration, and he knew it." Now, I mentioned that the Angels might have burned all the pictures of the Sea Pike. So their 3-week voyage across the Pacific was not a pleasant one. They were down in the cargo holds with bunks just welded together, stacked up, and when they had to do the blackout at night, they had to seal all the portholes and everything, so it got very stuffy. They're heading to the tropics, so it was very hot. It was just not a fun time. The merchant marine crew would actually steal things out of their bags and their foot lockers and so forth. And then they were only fed 2 meals a day, which they all laughed when we called them meals. They said they were not meals, but it was some kind of food. So the paratroopers would actually go in and steal the merchant marine's meals. There was one paratrooper who said he held his friend's legs as he crawled through the porthole, grabbed as much bread as he could, and then we pulled it back out and so forth. So when they got to New Guinea, my grandpa said none of my comrades had a kind word to say about that ship. And the division chaplain, Dr. Lee Walker, he later wrote, so again, this is coming from the chaplain. He said, "SS Sea Pike, wherever you are, may you rest and rust in shame." So they were just glad to get off when they landed on New Guinea. So they reached New Guinea, and then they set up camp at Dobadura, which was several miles inland. It was an old airstrip that the Allies are no longer using, so it was clear, so they just set up their tents and their camp areas and so forth. So while they were on New Guinea, they learned, they actually spent 6 months there training and acclimatizing to the jungle. There were veteran Australians and the local, they called them fuzzy wuzzies, but Papawans who taught them how to survive in the jungle, where to get water, what to eat, how to move silently through the undergrowth, that sort of thing. They also taught them. The locals were given a bounty system that if they brought back the ears of Japanese, they were given money. And so a lot of the Angels would go out with them to learn how to stalk in the jungle and so forth. But it's not to say it was all work. General Swing did tell his men, he said, "Think, eat, and dream of war. We're fighting a desperate enemy." He knew that they would soon be committed to combat. But the 511s did find some way to have fun. There's a lot of swimming. They did swimming all the time. They set up volleyball nets in the camp streets. Boxing and baseball and football were huge with the 11th Airborne in general. Again, there were a lot of former athletes. And of course, they were just boys being boys in the grass skirts there. And then of course there was the Whiskey Rebellion of Dobadura, where they built stills up in the hills to make their own jungle juice or white lightning. General Swing did not really approve of that, so he ordered the stills destroyed and brought in an ice cream machine from Australia as kind of a consolation prize. I'll let you decide if that was worth it or not. So one of the Angels' least enjoyable tasks while they were on New Guinea, again, New Guinea, where they were at Dobadura was there was still some operations going on in northern New Guinea, and the 11th Airborne was technically in reserve for those, so they got their first battle star. But where they were at, there were not a lot of service troops and so forth, so even the mighty Angels had to go down to the docks and help unload the ships, which they hated. But they made sure they were paid for their efforts. So they would actually steal whatever they wanted to while they were unloading the ships. Cans of food, crates of 45 pistols, grenade launchers, entire jeeps. They said that when the Angels left over there was an entire parking lot of vehicles in the jungle that they were never authorized to have, they just stole. One of the paratroopers said he and his buddy stole a duck. Right, if you know what the ducks are, and he said, I don't know why I did that, it just sounded like fun, so I just did it. So anyway, so they actually went down to the docks and they stole the generator off the docks. So they cut all the wires and they put it in the truck and they brought it back to camp. And of course the poor commander got kind of angry when he found out what had happened, so he went to General Swing and he just complained the whole time. And General Swing just said, it couldn't have been my boys, they're perfect angels. So that's part of where their moniker of the Angels comes from. And my grandpa laughed at that and he said it wasn't true, they stole everything they could get their hands on. But all good things come to an end. And on November 18th, again, almost 75 years ago to the day today, on November 18th, 1944, the Angels sailed for Leyte Harbor. So they actually landed over on the east side of the island, the east coast. And they were welcomed to Leyte by Japanese Mitsubishi bombers. So again, the war got very real very fast, and the Navy opened up with their anti-aircraft fire, and the Angels were obviously feeling a little bit nervous until 2 flights of P-38s and P-47s came in to rescue them. And then they sat on the deck and they would actually cheer the friendly pilots, like it was a boxing match. But Leyte was supposed to be just a stop on the Angels' way to fight on Luzon, but because the Allies' operations on Leyte were stalled, it was decided to commit the division to the front. Things were getting bogged down on Leyte's mountains. You can see kind of that center strip right there. That was the Japanese main supply line. And because of the steepness of those mountains, a lot of the other the American units were having trouble getting up there. And so the thought was, well, the 11th Airborne is a light airborne unit that, they're quick on their feet, so let's just send them up in the hills and see what they can do. So the Japanese were also landing fresh troops on the west coast, and the thought was, well, do we wait for them to come over the mountains to us, or do we go up in the mountains to meet them? And General Swing said, my boys can do this. And so they were sent up into the mountains. They were given a Thanksgiving breakfast of cold turkey and fruit salad, and then they were given 3 days rations. So while the island's monsoon rains were falling, the paratroopers of the 511th shouldered their rifles, mortars, and machine guns, and just headed up into the hills. So you can kind of see down where it says Dulag and Uranan, that's basically the line they followed in, and then they just went up into the hills. Little did they know what was waiting for them in those mountains. It rained almost every day, and the Angels had to use vines to climb up those steep hillsides, and then they would slide down the next ravine in the mud because there's no traction. Their foxholes filled with water, and when the sun went down, so did the temperatures because they got higher and higher in elevation. And they were just wearing tropical uniforms. So some of the paratroopers talked about putting their handkerchiefs in their teeth at night to keep them from chattering because they were so cold. They figured the Japanese could hear their teeth chattering, so they would bite their handkerchiefs. They said the Japanese infiltrated their mines or banzai attacked almost every night, so sleep was a lost friend on Leyte. And it didn't take long for the paratroopers to realize the maps they had were just completely useless. Trails disappeared into nothingness. Villages appeared on opposite ends of a sector, and the roads just basically stopped. There were no roads in the mountains. So they sent their reconnaissance platoon up, but Hard Rock's paratroopers more or less had to just feel their way forward into the jungle and up those hills. The first engagement with the enemy occurred when C Company and regimental headquarters encountered a few Japanese bathing in the river bottom, and there's an entire chapter on this in my book because there's debates on whether they were led into an ambush or they just made a bad decision. But when they shot those few Japanese they saw at the river bottom, well, it alerted all the Japanese that were up on the higher elevations to start firing down, so they found themselves trapped in a ravine, almost surrounded. So casualties were mounting, and C Company and RHQ, they fought back, and Colonel Haugen was right there with them. Right, he was firing right on the front lines. But he realized that they needed help, and the radios were not working due to the steepness of the terrain and so forth. So he took a handful of paratroopers and just marched all night through enemy lines, and he got back to Bararan and just kind of started coordinating relief efforts and so forth. But no one was happy with the way their first engagement went. One of the colonel's bodyguards said this was not how we were supposed to fight. We were supposed to be better than this. And C Company and RHQ took some heavy losses. But it taught them that number one, do not underestimate the enemy. And number two, they realized they were getting outside the range of their artillery support. And so one of the things they did was several miles inland, they decided to airdrop their pack howitzers on a hilltop, which made them feel much better. And the pilot who did that, sometimes it's very easy to overlook the pilots of these transport craft, the C-47s, in regards and say the paratroopers are the brave ones, but these C-47 pilots had a pretty tough job when it comes to having to slow down for a drop, become an easy target. Well, there was no danger of that on this drop, but he had to make the run 13 times to drop all the pack howitzers on this hilltop, and he had to go through a very narrow ravine and pull up right at the end, and then make the drop, and it's pretty dangerous. So I think they bought that guy a beer or two afterwards. But when they got into the hills, the 511th was facing the remains of two Japanese divisions, the 16th and the 26th. And as they got further and further into the hills, as the days went on, the jungle started taking its own toll by itself. A lot of the paratroopers had dysentery, dengue fever, they had skin ulcers, they were starting to have a rough time. And the weather got worse. So resupply became impossible because as you go on higher, there's no way a C-47 can navigate into the clouds when they can't even see the mountains in front of them. One C-47 that tried crashed and everybody died but one of the loadmasters on there. So the Angels were kind of on their own for a little while. They said for the 33 days they were on Leyte, they were hungry for most of it. D Company ate rats, roots, berries, and a dog to survive out there. But things got worse, and they realized something had to be done. So what the Angels did, they had all their L4 and L5 Piper Cubs, and the pilot said, well, let's put supplies in the back of our planes. We can fly up. We're a little more nimble. We'll just fly up into the hills, and when we get over the units, we'll just push supplies out. So that actually saved the division while they were up in the hills. So they had high respect for their Piper Cub pilots. It was a dangerous and very courageous thing to do, and to this day they all say it saved their lives up there. And while they were fighting, again, it was close quarters. They said you couldn't see more than 10 or 15 feet in front of you in the jungle. The Japanese would just appear out of the jungle like ghosts in darkness. And the 511th, they gave as good as they got, but they were taking casualties. And they said that their medics and surgeons were just extraordinary. These men worked on casualties. They did cranial surgery under ponchos with a flashlight in a muddy foxhole. One example of this was F Company's Harold Spring. He was nearly cut in half by a Japanese machine gun. And everybody thought he was dead until they went out and they got him and thought he was alive. So they brought him back. And the regimental surgeon, Thomas Nestor, he said, dig a small trench, put Harold in there. One of the medics held a poncho up, and Captain Nestor just opened up his stomach, took out the bullets, sutured everything up, closed him up, and then just went on to the next casualty. The next day, Captain Nestor came back, and he expected to just bury Harold in that same trench, but Harold not only survived, he actually survived the war, right? And he thanked Captain Nestor. He called him Captain Marvel for saving his life. And I gotta say, Harold's a pretty big marvel surviving that. But he agreed with Dr. Nestor, who said there should be doctors for paratroopers and doctors for ordinary people. So about 3 weeks into the campaign, the paratroopers were dug in around a hill called Mahalnag, I'm not sure how to say that exactly, to disrupt the enemy's main supply line. So they were in the middle of the enemy's main supply line. They had pushed in and destroyed every enemy unit they saw. So they're now sitting on the main Japanese supply line, which the Japanese knew and sent attack after attack after attack, trying to push them off and get them out of there. The Angels patrols at the same time would come back with battle trophies, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. One of the paratroopers gave me his flag, which you can come up and look at after if you'd like. But I do want to talk about one of the things that they did to survive while they were in the hills was, I told you their radios weren't working that great. So what they did was their anti-aircraft company, they weren't doing much, so they took radios into the hills and they created relay posts. As the regiment went further and further, they could then do a short radio burst and talk to each other. But then the Piper Cub pilots, they called it the mostly milk run. They would actually fly every morning in the same path and figure out, they would radio down to the guys on the ground and figure out where the different units were, and they would come back and map them at headquarters. So even though they were up there with no maps, no trails, no nothing, everybody knew where they were, which was pretty amazing. So this is a picture of D Company up there, excuse me, Mahanag. It's a very blurry picture. Red Zadorian, the trooper who took these pictures, said, I did the best I could. We were not Marines. We didn't have embedded photographers. They're Hollywood. We were just airborne. So he said that his film, very much deteriorated in the jungle climate, but he got some great pictures, and I'll show you some more later. But you can see kind of how ragged they are at this point. They would use just parachutes for covering, digging their foxholes. Their boots were starting to fall apart because of the mud and the rain and so forth. So a lot of them talked about the heels falling off their jump boots, which if you know anything about jump boots, when those heels fall off, it's very awkward to walk in. And then some of them just would have to go barefoot or take, if they could find dead paratroopers' boots and they fit, they put those on. So it was, they called this Hard Rock Hill, number one, because the colonel was there, but number two, because it was a pretty hard time there. So this is a picture of a resupply from Piper Cub. You can kind of see he's dropping, a crate right there coming down. So my grandpa said that the first man killed in his platoon was actually hit by an ammo crate. One of the Piper Cubs just flying overhead, and again it was very foggy and it was very rainy. So obviously the Piper Cub pilot didn't mean to, but landed and hit him right on the head. But they were very grateful for this because it allowed them to keep going forward, because they were now pretty far inland and they had to get to Ormoc on the other side. And since the larger transports couldn't do anything, again, those Piper Cub pilots were saviors on Leyte. So this is one of the patrols that came back with the battle flag. But by this point, the Angels the paratroopers they said they were tired, they were hungry, they were all sick. So they were just ornery. They said they were just ornery. And so a lot of these patrols, they didn't always know how they would find the strength, because they're starving, and they would just get up, and they said you wouldn't let your buddies down, you would just go on patrols with them and just watch their backs and so forth. So there were names like Hard Rock Hill, Purple Heart Hill, Maggot Hill, and Hacksaw Ridge. Within the division, they became synonymous with these little private acts of courage and loyalty to each other that we just don't have time today to do justice. Suffice it to say, Colonel Haugen's paratroopers continued their push west until on December 21st, 1944, the Angels dug in on the western slopes of Leyte's mountains, and they could overlook Ormoc Bay, so they could actually smell the sea air, which they said was just this breath of fresh air. After 4 weeks of hell, they looked at the ocean, but the only obstacle in their way was one last stubborn line of Japanese emplacements that pushed back an attack by E&F companies. And again, most of the regiments at this time had taken heavy losses. D Company came down out of the hills with 60% strength, and that was pretty common. And this was only 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, some of these companies had lost 40% of their strength. So when they got to this point and they had to break through this last line, everybody wanted it, but when those two companies got pushed back, D Company was up. And so they were told to make an early morning attack, because the Japanese were famous for sleeping late. And it was up a very, very, very narrow spine. So narrow they could only walk single file up to the top of the ridge, which, if any of you are infantry, you know how dangerous that can be, just because of where they were going to go. But they did, first platoon with my grandpa in command. First squad, when they got to the top, went left, second squad went right, and they just completely caught the Japanese by surprise. They actually kind of fanned out and they started charging in what they called the rat's ass charge, and they said they fired on anything that moved because they wanted to get out of those hills. So they fired on anything that moves, and when they got a little bit higher and they were looking down, they realized they were looking at an entire Japanese column that was moving on the trail. So again, just first platoon, there's about 35 guys, and they're looking at this entire column, and they all, they cleared the Japanese out of the foxholes, they dropped in, and they just started firing, and Grandpa said, I estimate we killed over 300 that day alone, just first platoon. So the way to Ormoc was now open, and on Christmas Day itself, they started coming down out of the hills, and they carried their wounded with them, and their column was several miles long, and they just said it was a gray morning. It was just a cloudy morning. Nobody was really in a great mood. I mean, after 4 weeks of what they call hell, they just wanted to get out of there, and they said they just wanted to rest and get clean and sleep and have nobody bother them anymore. So as they're coming down out of the hills, somebody at the front of the column started to sing, right? O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. O come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of Angels. And other voices soon joined in, and pretty soon you had this several miles long column singing Christmas carols as they came down out of the hills. So they had broken Japan's main supply line on Leyte and left nearly 6,000 enemy dead behind. But their victories had come at a great cost. And I told you that the D Company had taken losses. The regiment itself was down to about 60% strength in 4 weeks. As one paratrooper put it, after Leyte, hell was a vacation. Well, the Angels were not given much time to rest. The break from combat would only last until January 31st, when most of the 11th Airborne sailed for Luzon. You can see over there on the left, Nasukbu. They did an amphibious landing, so this was mostly the glider, infantry, artillery, and a few of the other units. They all landed there, and they pushed east. And you can see down there in the Aga Pass, they got stuck for a little bit. The Japanese had dug in on the hills with artillery and emplacements, and there was some concern here because up north you had several Allied divisions pushing south into Manila. Well, here you have the 11th Airborne, which was already under strength because it's an airborne division, and they had already taken heavy losses. So they figured that the further they got in, if the Japanese realized how few of them there were, they could cut them off and destroy them. So they wanted to push in to get to Gaitai Ridge there, where the 511th would drop a few days later. So one of the things the Angels did was they sent out thousands of fake radio messages just to appear much bigger. And then when they went in, they would just, as they got further up the road, they would just race up and down the road in their Jeeps and their trucks, just trying to appear that there were maybe two divisions instead of a little itty-bitty airborne one. So eventually this force broke through the Aga Pass. They got to the southern edge of Tagaytay Ridge, right there. And then on February 2nd, the paratroopers of the 511th boarded C-47s, and a few hours later, they jumped on Tagaytay Ridge, and they said it was a pretty easy jump, actually. They landed in fields, and they just hoped they didn't drift to southwest and landed in Lake Tal, because where that road is, pretty much everything to the west of that was very, very steep, and they said, as long as we don't drift over, we're fine. Most of them landed on target. So the division joined them that night, and while they were there, they could actually look north at night, and they saw the horizon light up, and they realized the Japanese were starting to burn the city. There were some terrible atrocities committed in Manila. If you've ever studied the Battle for Manila, it was brutal. It really was. So the paratroopers were pretty angry about this because they knew that those were civilians up there suffering. There was a great desire to get into Manila as soon as possible. So they pushed up Highway 17 until they got into the city itself. They pushed through Imas and Las Piñas and Paranaque, This is where they hit what is known as the Genko line. So here's some photos of the actual drop on Toccoa Ridge. So my grandpa said, on that picture on the left, he said, I'm one of those white dots. He said when he was coming down, he kind of drifted through some clouds, and when he got out of the clouds, his feet were touching the canopy of one of his buddies, and he's like, needless to say, we adjusted our descent. So anyway, so on the ground, so they pushed north into Manila, so let me see if I get the right one here. So they hit what was called the Genko line. So the Genko line was this defensive monstrosity that the Japanese had built along southern Manila. The Japanese had always anticipated the Allies coming up from the south, so they took all the sunken naval ships, they took the guns off, and put them on the Genko line. And they took all the anti-aircraft guns they had, and then they pointed level, right? And they took all the machine guns, and they built these pillboxes. I mean, it was just, Normandy was rough, but the Genko line was just, it was a nightmare. And again, this is the 11th Airborne, so all they had really were their pack howitzers and a few 105s, and that was it. And they couldn't really call on air support at the time because General MacArthur didn't want to destroy the city. So they said that they had to assault the Genko line with nothing but flamethrowers, grenades, machine guns, light artillery, guts, and men of the highest caliber. So it was, well, I should say one thing. My grandpa talked about fighting on the Genko line, and D Company was put in front of the division going up, and then 1st Platoon was put in front of D Company. So he said we were the tip of the spear, and he said when he told his squad leaders about it, they all kind of said the same thing, like, why do we get all the dirty jobs? But they ended up breaking through the Genko line outside Paranaque, which was a pretty big deal at the time. They destroyed 8 pillboxes without a single casualty. So, of course, the division was very happy, and so was D Company. And then D Company felt they were being rewarded by the heavens because they encountered a Japanese officers' club full of whiskey and sake. Right? Now, Captain Kavanaugh had some concern, even though the first sergeant said, let's distribute this evenly. He said, well, we still have to go, we still have to finish fighting in, so I'm worried about a drunk company. He said, let's leave a sentry here, we'll come back for it. Well, by the time they got back there, battalion and regimental officers had already cleaned it out. And so D Company did not see a single drop. So you can imagine how happy they were about that one. And so they were actually very happy when, a couple weeks later, they liberated a brewery, and the brewery thanked them by sending a truckload of beer to their camp. So they came back. Karma, right? Karma. So 8 days into their campaign, the 511th was really starting to feel the strain, right? Those 8 days pushing into Manila, it was pretty brutal. When they got into southern Manila, it became street fighting. It was house to house, it was block to block. The Japanese would barricade themselves in buildings and use hostages. I mean, it was nothing they'd really trained for, but the Angels got really creative in how they dealt with this. When they got there, they were taking huge casualties, and at one point, Captain Kavanaugh selected an assembly point to the rear. They were given a little bit of a break from the line because they'd been fighting for 8 days. And he grew frustrated because he felt like his company was just not moving fast enough. And so he chewed out his first sergeant, Paul Farnsworth. And Paul just kind of stopped and he looked at the captain. He said, Captain, that's all there is. Everybody else is gone. Right? And it really stopped Captain Kavanaugh in his tracks. He told me before he died, he said in 5 days of fighting, D Company had sustained 38 men killed or wounded. So a third of D Company. And most of the other companies were in the same boat. John Ringler of B Company, he said, you never leave your buddies. They're as much of you as you are yourself. And I think that personal feeling carried you through when you lost one. It was devastating. As every veteran knows, Hollywood fails to really portray the most intimate moments between soldiers. Those who have not served cannot fully understand what it means when one soldier says to his buddy, tell my wife, or there's a letter in this pocket, or I hope when it comes that it's quick. My grandfather, Lieutenant Carrico, explained, there is a feeling of closeness and love for your fellow men in combat that is different from any other feeling that you can have. I know that some of you here today know what that's like, and some who are watching know what that's like as well. Well, the war continued, and no one was really given a rest in the division. They had to keep going. So the Angels' efforts to liberate Manila included the taking of the Cavite Naval Base, Nichols Field, the Manila Polo Club, Fort McKinley, and the historic Intramuros, which was a kind of a walled-off area of Manila. These were tremendously difficult nuts to crack. The Japanese had 4 years to build up their defenses, and plus some of these were former American posts and fortifications the Japanese just took over and reinforced and so forth. And so everybody, every angel I talked to talked about losing friends in these fights. But one fight, or one loss touched everybody, and that was on February 11th when General Swing and Colonel Haugen and other officers moved into the CP of the 187th Glider Infantry. They were still in Manila at the time. D Company, Grandpa's D Company was dug in about 30 yards away, and so they saw this. So you have all the brass, right, gathered around this oak table in the CP, and they're looking at the maps, the situation maps, trying to decide the next thing. Well, a 40 millimeter enemy anti-aircraft shell came right through an open window and hit right in the table and just burst. So it killed one of the aides in the room, but also Colonel Haugen took a piece of shrapnel right to the chest. And so he just dropped to the ground, and they rushed him over to the Las Piñas Church, which is very historic. It has like a 200-year-old organ in there, bamboo organ, that's beautiful. But the Angels were using it as a hospital. Unfortunately, all the surgeons were busy, and so the colonel was attended to by the dentist because he was the only one who could do anything. But eventually he got a little bit more attention, and he was actually expected to fully recover. So he was flown to a Ford hospital, and then they were gonna fly him on February 22nd to Indonesia for further recovery. But during that flight, the medical transport was attacked by Japanese Zeros. So the pilot tried to go through evasive maneuvers, and while he was doing that, Hard Rock asked his nurse for a cigarette. He was a chain smoker. Like while they're on Leyte and they didn't have cigarettes, guys remember Colonel Haugen putting his cigarettes on sticks at the very end so he could smoke it as long as possible, right? So he's sitting there with, recovering from a chest wound, and he asked for a cigarette. Well, the nurse brought one back, but by the time she got back, the colonel was dead. And that was hard news for the whole regiment to hear, that their commander who had formed their regiment and brought them all the way here had died. They had a hard time accepting that. They said it couldn't be, not our rock. But it was. He died at 38 years of age. I was reading some papers one time, and there was a general who was writing something about the colonel, and there was this question that said, what awards was Hard Rock given? And the general said he should have gotten everything the Army could give him, right, for what he did. But the war continued, so General Swing drove over to the 511's headquarters, and he told the executive officer, Colonel Ed Lottie, "You're in charge now," and he just left. That was it. He didn't say anything. He just said, "Hogan's been hit. You're in charge," and that was it. So Lottie knew there was no time to mourn. He said there was just too much going on. Every unit was engaged. So they also kept hearing about news of the population suffering. So this was a big thing for the Angels. They all grew in their hatred for the Japanese because they would see the civilians suffering, burned alive, raped, whatever. D companies saw a mother bringing a wagon up to them asking for help. When they looked in the wagon, there's a little girl who had her jaw shot off, and they said, "What happened?" And the mother just said, "Japanese machine gun," and the little girl died. So they pushed into Manila. They fought hard. Manila was declared secure, and then of course we have the division's famous raid on Los Baños, which where they liberated 2,147 civilians who had been prisoners of the Japanese for 4 years. It was a textbook raid. This is one of the reconnaissance photos. You can see the camp up there, kind of outlined and so forth. But it was pretty amazing. The B company dropped at about 400 feet. The division's reconnaissance platoon and Filipino guerrillas snuck up to the camp, took out the guard towers. B Company dropped. They got all the prisoners out, and then they brought them back. This is actually footage of the rescue. So they loaded them up in Amtraks and then floated them back across Laguna de Bay. And it was a pretty amazing thing. There were no casualties. And this raid is still taught in military institutions around the world today. The reason it didn't get more attention at the time was because a few miles away, the flag raising was going on Iwo Jima. So that got front page, and this got way, way, way back. So a little funny story about this, when one of the paratroopers was getting the civilians to go out of the camp, she looked at him, and they'd never seen paratroopers before. 4 years prisoners, they'd never seen paratroopers. So she looked at him and she said, "Are you a Marine?" He said, "Hell no, I'm a paratrooper." And she looked at him and she said, "All these years I've been here in Los Baños, I was hoping to be rescued by the Marines." So he just yelped her anyway, right? So we're going to fast forward just for the sake of time. I love this picture of these kids down here, getting a real meal for the first time in who knows how long, right? And then up there with the angels with the baby, and then this one down over here, you have the Gia, the angels flirting with the girls, of course. Angels will be angels, right? So we'll skip that one for a second. Well, the angels they went west out of Manila, then headed down to southern Manila, where they cleared out the remaining enemy, pretty heavily defended areas actually, and mountain ranges and so forth. So many amazing stories to tell there. Again, if you want the full story, just gotta buy the book. Just don't have time for it today. So the angels were preparing for the invasion, right? Which nobody was really looking forward to. They estimated 1 million casualties. All the angels said that probably would have been the end of me and all my buddies. The division chaplain, Lee Walker, he actually got to go to some of these planning meetings for the invasion and to see what the 11th Airborne, what they were going to jump into and what the missions would be. And he said it would have been hell, spelled in capital letters. So every angel that I've ever talked to, they all thanked their country and God for the dropping of the atomic bomb. They said it saved our lives and the lives of a lot of other people. But just because they weren't going to jump on Japan doesn't mean they weren't going to go. The division was moved to Okinawa, and then they were given a very short notice that they were going to go up to Atsuki, Japan, where they were the first unit into Japan. Right? They went combat loaded, and they were told, the Japanese say they're going to surrender, but if they attack you, hold your ground, we will try to get to you as soon as we can. So all these angels that were going in these first flights, they were all a little nervous until they got to the ground and realized the Japanese were serious and that they were actually going to surrender. So they established a defensive perimeter around the Atsuki airfield. They raised the first American flag on Japan, right over here. And I'm sorry, the names escape me, but one of the photographers that came with them picked these 3 guys, and he said, "Hey, let's go up on the roof and let's raise this flag." And of course they're like, "Yeah, let's do that." So he was hoping to get kind of an iconic picture like the flag raising on Iwo Jima and so forth. But it's not a picture you see super often, but it is pretty historically important that this is the first flag raised on Japan. This is a few hours after they landed. And then a few hours later, General MacArthur himself landed. He didn't give him very long to get set up. So this is, you can see General Swing right there in the helmet, and right there is Warrant Officer Berkland, who is leading the division band to kind of welcome General MacArthur. And after this, he walked over and he whispered in his ear and he said, "You tell those boys that's the sweetest music I've ever heard." Right? And then of course he went and did all the handshaking and so forth. And then there's this famous picture at Atsuki, General Eichelberger, and then General Swing is over on the left, right over there, right? It was almost a surreal experience for the Angels, right? Other units were going to slowly start coming in after that, but they were the first ones there, and they were the first ones to encounter the Japanese, the population, and so forth. They actually loaded up into, the Japanese were ordered to have vehicles there, so they had these really, really run-down trucks, just all over the airfield that the Angels piled into, because they had escort General MacArthur into Yokohama. And you can see in this picture here, these are members of the 11th Airborne who formed part of General MacArthur's honor guard. So I guess if you want to send a message, don't mess with this hotel, you just put a bunch of angels in front of it, just like that. And there's a funny story about the angels stealing General MacArthur's dinner, but we'll save that for another day. No time today, no time today. But the angels were pretty important at this time. How many of you have seen this picture before? Anybody seen this picture before? These are the surrender docks going out to Missouri. So those are angels, right? Those are angels that were mostly from the 511th PIR, but they were given guard duty that day. So those are all the cars bringing the dignitaries. They load up and then head out to Missouri for the signing and so forth. You can actually see General MacArthur General Swing in this picture right here. This is, I think everybody's seen this one. But General Swing is right there in the second row on the right-hand side. He's got kind of a cap on. Those are called swing caps. And then, yes?
Is that General Wainwright?
Yes, that is, yes. Yeah, this was General MacArthur. Remember, he signs with different pens, and he gave one to General Wainwright. Yeah, great question. So one little known fact about the surrender ceremony is that after the documents were signed, they had to get the copy back to Washington. So they picked one of the paratroopers from the 511th. He was 6'3", which is pretty tall for a paratrooper. His name was Tom Messerow. But they were going to handcuff a briefcase to his wrist, and then he was going to fly him back. But because he was a paratrooper, he was so tall, and he was a football player, so he had a presence. And so everybody took his picture while he was getting the documents, and they realized this was not going to be very secure. So they ended up giving him dummy papers to take back to Washington, and then there were some sailors that pretended they were drunk, and they got the actual documents off the ship, and then they flew back to Washington. Right? So the things you never hear. But there is another funny story. When General Swing got back to those docks, right, and then he was walking back up, and then 1st Cavalry was landing at the next docks over. So the division band had been playing all morning for all the dignitaries. So when 1st Cav got there, the Angels band kind of turned to him, and there was a big sign on the wall that said, "Welcome to Japan, compliments of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment." So, 1st Cav likes to say we were the first in Manila and first in Tokyo, and the Angels always say, like, yeah, we beat you by 3 days. What's your big whoop? So when 1st Cav landed, the Angels band turned to him and they started playing the old gray mare, she ain't what she used to be, right? So the 1st Cav commanders got mad. He goes and he starts chewing out all the Angels and so forth. And there's another funny story about when one of their units came to a local brewery. The General MacArthur's staff had ordered, I think it was G Company of the 511th, to guard. So these cavalry officer, he comes up and he says, "I have to get in there," and it was a major, I believe, and the paratrooper was just a sergeant, and he locks and loads his Thompson, and he said, "You can't come in here." And he said, "Who are you?" The cavalry officer said, "Who are you people?" And the sergeant just said, "We're the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Who are you?" Right? And the major got mad and he said, "Don't you salute a superior officer?" The sergeant just looked at him and he said, "I do, but you don't have jump wings on your chest." You need teeth, So there's a lot of stories like that. Like the 511th had character, and they had class. As much as I call them hellraisers, they're heroes. They stayed on Japan as part of the occupation force until 1949. The post-war years, they helped establish democracy. One quick story really fast. We're running out of time. This photo over here, this is Bud Stapleton, who went into Tokyo before MacArthur, and he and his buddy put this flag up on the radio building, and then his buddy submitted the photo to the AP, but didn't put his name, he just put Bud's name. So this photo went out saying, "First flag raised over Tokyo," right? Well, if you know anything about General MacArthur, you know that he had a little bit of an ego. So when he found out that a lowly paratrooper lieutenant had gone to Tokyo before him and raised this flag, the lieutenant said, "You have no idea what it's like to be chewed out until you've been chewed out by a 5-star general." But the Queen of England wrote him a letter and said, "Good job on raising that flag." So the Angels stayed as part of the occupation force. They became very known for the way they gave clothes to the destitute families, and they gave candy and chocolates to the children, cigarettes to the adults, which now we frown on that, but that was a big thing at the time. They helped rebuild infrastructure and so forth. They did such a good job that in 1998, Japan's ambassador to the U.S., he wrote Colonel Ed Leyte, who again was commander. He said, "I firmly believe that your gallant peacekeeping efforts have contributed tremendously to the current mutual reliance between the United States and Japan." Now, I know that, again, our time is up. I hope that I've been able to provide at least a brief glimpse into the character and sacrifices of the 11th Airborne, especially the 511th PIR. And I hope that this lecture gives us all a moment to pause to appreciate the freedoms we enjoy and that so many in our world take for granted. And I should leave you with this last thought. One paratrooper who never signed his name to this, but he said, "Dear Lord, I hope this current generation of young Americans will someday be worthy of the generation of young people who saved my country and kept it free." I can only say amen to that, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.